On March 9, 2020, the Utah Jazz were a franchise built on something that can't be replicated in a salary cap system. They had stability, quiet excellence, a small market success story defined by two basketball players who couldn't have been more different, yet somehow complemented each other perfectly. But in the span of a few seconds, in a cramped media room, that carefully constructed stability was vaporized. What we're about to tell you is the story of how a single moment of human carelessness dismantled a decade of building. This is the story of trust breaking in the NBA and what happens when the music stops. Part 1. The Perfect Marriage. To understand the weight of March 9th, you have to understand what the Utah Jazz had built. They weren't a glamorous franchise. Utah wasn't Los Angeles or New York or Miami. They didn't have the attention of the national media or the endorsement portfolios of traditional superpowers. What they had was something more valuable. They had balance. Rudy Gobert was the foundation, a 7'1" French defensive anchor who played like he was built in a previous era, one where defense meant something. He valued accountability above all else. He was the traditionalist, the guy who ran the gym floor with silent intensity and absolute rigor. On the other end of the court was Donovan Mitchell. Young, electric, a guard who could score from anywhere on the floor, who brought charisma and flair back to Salt Lake City. Mitchell was the engine. He was the offensive creator, the franchise's lifeblood in a way that Gobert could never be. They were never going to be best friends. Their personalities were too different, but they didn't need to be best friends. They needed to be a basketball marriage. And for 2 years, they were the league's most efficient pick-and-roll duo. They executed with clinical precision. Every action was predictable because it was perfected. But beneath the surface, beneath the winning seasons and the all-star selections, the gears were already grinding. Part 2. The Cracks in the Foundation. By early March 2020, the public didn't know it yet, but the Utah Jazz were a team fracturing along invisible lines. Rudy Gobert had become increasingly vocal about defensive accountability. He was frustrated with the backcourt. Mitchell, meanwhile, was carrying the offensive burden. He was the franchise's only true creator, and he felt that weight every night. There was a coldness between them, not a rivalry, not anything that rose to drama. It was worse. It was professional distance. This worked as long as the team was winning. Professional distance is fine when your team's winning, but the pandemic was brewing, the world was changing, and in a locker room filled with tension, sometimes all it takes is one match to light the fire. That match came in a press conference on March 9th. The NBA had just announced new social distancing protocols. The coronavirus was a threat, they said. Everyone should be careful. Everyone should take it seriously. Rudy Gobert stood up. He looked at the assembled microphones and recording devices on the table in front of him, and then, in full view of the media, he leaned across and mockingly rubbed his hands across every single one of them. He was laughing. The room laughed with him. He thought he was funny. He thought he was proving that the fear was overblown. He thought he was the smartest guy in the room. 48 hours later, Rudy Gobert tested positive for COVID-19. The Oklahoma City Health Department stormed the court where the Jazz were about to play. The season suspended. And in the eyes of the sports world, Rudy Gobert became patient zero. Part 3. The Immediate Fallout. The immediate aftermath was unlike anything the NBA had ever experienced. The Jazz were quarantined in their locker room for 9 hours. Elite athletes, the best in the world, reduced to a state of quiet terror. They didn't know who else was infected. They didn't know if the virus would come for them next. They sat in that locker room in silence. But it wasn't the silence of solidarity. It was the silence of fear and betrayal. When Donovan Mitchell's positive test came back the next morning, the joke wasn't funny anymore. The punchline had arrived. and something broke inside that team that would never fully heal. Mitchell was furious. He later told the media that he was pissed. Years later, he would admit that it took him a very long time to even look at Rudy's name on his phone. The trust was dead. Part 4. The 2-Year Cold War. The NBA returned to play in the bubble, and for a brief window, it looked like the Jazz might overcome the trauma. They had some time to heal. They had weeks in isolation together. But when they returned to the court, the cameras told the truth that their statistics hid. They didn't high-five. They didn't sit on the bench together. They didn't embrace during timeouts. They were two solo acts sharing a stage, performing a script they no longer believed in. In 2021, the Utah Jazz finished with the best record in the entire NBA. On paper, they were a juggernaut. In reality, they were broken. And when the playoffs came, everyone saw what the Jazz already knew. Broken teams don't win championships. The collapse against the Clippers, the first-round exit to the Mavericks. Every defeat was traced back not to talent or coaching or bad luck, but to the lack of soul. To the fact that when things got tough, this team didn't lean on each other. They looked for someone to blame. The national media tracked them obsessively. How many times did Mitchell pass to Gobert per game? They turned a microphone incident into a literal scoreboard of their deteriorating relationship. Every number became a measurement of how far apart they had drifted. By 2022, when Danny Ainge took over as CEO, he didn't see a championship contender. He saw a broken home. Part 5. The Exodus. The exodus was swift and decisive. Rudy Gobert was sent to Minnesota in a trade package that shocked the entire league. Mitchell was shipped to Cleveland shortly after. The revenge tour was over. The chapter closed. But the scar remained. Looking back from 2026, both men have found new identities and new successes. Rudy anchored a Minnesota defense that returned to the Western Conference Finals. Mitchell became the undisputed king of Cleveland, a franchise icon in his own right. They moved forward. They healed. But Utah never did. Part 6. The Shadow That Remains. In Salt Lake City, the shadow of those microphones still lingers. It stands as a masterclass in how fragile professional relationships are, how a single moment, not of poor play, not of bad luck, but of human carelessness, can dismantle a decade of building. The Utah Jazz didn't die because they weren't good enough. Basketball teams can overcome talent gaps. They can overcome injuries. They can overcome bad luck. But they cannot overcome a fundamental breach of trust. They cannot overcome the moment when the man standing next to you becomes someone you can no longer believe in. On March 11, 2020, the NBA season was suspended for 4 months. But for the Utah Jazz, the season never truly resumed. The music had stopped. The lights had dimmed, and a joke that wasn't funny had finally reached its punchline. This is what happens when you forget that basketball is a team sport. This is what happens when the smallest moments carry the greatest consequences. And this is the story of how the heart of a franchise stopped beating on March 9, 2020.